So the purpose of this tour is to try and in some way take us back in time 2.5 millennia or so, and help us to imagine the historical context of the book of Isaiah that we find in the Old Testament in our Bibles. One of the particular features of the Bible, as opposed to, I think, the texts of most of the other major religions, is that it is at its heart a historical narrative, which I think many people don't realize nowadays. Over the last 100 years or so, the public teaching of the Bible has been systematically pushed out of our culture, except on controversial moral issues. And the result of that is that many, I think particularly many young people, view the Bible suspiciously as a book of dodgy moral teachings that should have been left behind in ages past. But whether you think the morals are dodgy or not, the Bible isn't actually primarily about that. It is a history book. It records what happened to real people in real time and space. And most importantly, it is also a book about God and his plans and purposes for our world, as worked out in and through those people and events. Now, because the Bible is a historical book concerning real people and real events, unsurprisingly, they have left records behind. Obviously, we have written records, such as the Bible itself, but also archaeological records, which brings us to our tour today. And we're going to use some of the archaeology that we find in the British Museum, both to see how well it corroborates with the Bible's records, and therefore give us confidence in the accuracy of those records, but also to help us to imagine the world that Isaiah lived in. Fortunately for us, our British forefathers nicked a lot of stuff from around the world and put it in the British Museum, which raises some interesting ethical questions, but it also makes our tour a possibility today. You really couldn't do a tour like this in many, if any, other museums in the world. Now, I tried to structure this tour so that it's accessible, even if you've never read Isaiah or any of the Bible, as I was saying before. So let's begin by asking, who was Isaiah? Isaiah was a Jewish prophet who lived in Jerusalem around about the year 700 BC. And he lived in a time of crisis. During his lifetime, the nation of Assyria to the north were becoming an extremely powerful nation, probably the world's first superpower, in fact. And they were a huge threat to the Jewish people of Israel. Isaiah's job as prophet was to be God's mouthpiece to the king and the people. He was trying to help them make sense of what was going on the world stage and offer theological insight, or to put it in layman's terms, to explain what on earth God was up to, allowing this crisis to happen. But before we get to Isaiah himself and some of the archaeology of his day, I want to start with a bit of big picture scene setting, because his life's work only really makes sense within the context of the whole Old Testament narrative. So just for a few minutes to begin with, I'm going to try and give you the rough gist of the Bible up to Isaiah's lifetime. And I'm going to use the diagram in your handout to help. And we also have a couple of exhibits to look at in just a second as well. Okay, so here's a rough Bible timeline. The first 11 chapters of the Bible in the book of Genesis paint a broad brushstroke picture of the beginnings of our world. Possibly it was written as a historical record, possibly it is more allegorical, possibly a combination of the two, depending on how you read it. But either way, the picture it paints is a very interesting one. In particular, these chapters are concerned not so much with how the world was made and what processes were used, as is sometimes assumed, but rather what humanity's purpose is and what their relationship is like with the God who made them. And what these chapters tell us is that God made our world to be full of beauty and delight. It was his good creation, and he was very pleased with it. And he made humans to be in charge and to have responsibility to look after the world and to make it flourish. Our job is to be stewards of the world under the authority of God himself. But in reality, what mankind did, according to Genesis chapters 1 to 11, was to take that vocation and corrupt it. Our tendency is to devote ourselves to things of our own making rather than God himself. and we become distorted, and all sorts of problems follow. And in these chapters, God intervenes in a way that restricts mankind because of our tendency to go astray. He doesn't let man live forever. He makes the ground hard to work. He disperses them when they become too powerful, such as in the famous story of the Tower of Babel. This is the Bible's basic framework on our world, a world that has the hallmarks of being wonderful, but which is messed up and unable to flourish because of human idolatry and corruption. It is a broken world. But the rest of the Bible's narrative is about God's commitment to the world that he loves, to sort it out and make it new, not by eradicating mankind, but by transforming mankind and transforming his world into a new world. And the way he chooses to do that is by taking one man in Genesis chapter 12, named Abraham, and promising that in him and through the people that will come from him, he will transform the world. And that people are the Hebrews, who will later be called Israel or the Jews. This is the point where the Bible becomes a clearly historical narrative, because the lens focuses in on what happens to Abraham and his descendants. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament is all about the nation of Israel and God's plans to begin to sort out the world in and through them. And this brings us to our first exhibit, which is the enormous statue of Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt. Here we are in the West Wing of the British Museum, and we're going to go and stand in front of Ramesses II. See if I can get closer. There we go. This is the enormous bust of King Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, who came to the throne in 1279 BC. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of doing this virtually is you just don't get the effect of how massive this bit of statue actually is. Ancient Egypt was a powerful country, and Ramesses was an extremely powerful king. And if you're a powerful king, the thing to do is to make a huge statue of yourself. It's all part of the job. And especially necessary in Ramesses' case, given he was actually less than 5 foot tall in real life. Massive statue, much more likely to intimidate everyone. It's carved from a single block of granite, and if you look carefully, you can just about see that it is a red and black coloured granite. That's not just an aesthetic choice. Egypt was known as Deshret and Kemet, or red land and black land. So red and black granite symbolizes that he rules over both the red land and the black land, in other words, the whole of Egypt. Ramesses was a great warrior king, a prolific builder, and had between 80 and 90 children. One suspects that he may have delegated the parenting of his progeny to his many wives and concubines. He was also a real opportunist. He made many statues of himself like this one, but he also realized that he could cut corners simply by renaming existing statues of past pharaohs and pretending that they were him. Why build a new one when all you have to do is edit the inscription on an existing one? I mean, everyone will forget who it was sooner or later anyway. So we have many statues of Ramesses, but perhaps not all of them were of him originally. One of his great achievements was to build a memorial complex at Thebes. He built a whole temple where he would be venerated during his lifetime and deified in death and worshipped as a god. That might sound like a strange idea to us, but remember, the Egyptians worshipped a pantheon of gods who had power over different areas of life, the rains, the Nile, the sun, etc. So if you have a very powerful emperor who ruled for over 50 years, well, he's basically a demigod, isn't he? And wouldn't this statue convey that message to all of his kingdom? When the statue first came to the British Museum in the early 1800s, it inspired the poet Shelley to write a poem about him called Ozymandias, which is his Greek name. And Shelley brilliantly captured his confident arrogance in these famous lines. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Now, the history of the people of Israel begins in the land of Egypt as well, under the reign of this very same emperor, Ramesses. Or at least it's either him or one of his predecessors, depending on how you date it. Abraham's descendants ended up as slaves in the land of Egypt a few generations later due to an unfortunate set of circumstances. And Ramesses was a very harsh taskmaster. He subjected them to terrible forced labor, even deliberately making their tasks more difficult. But of course, what Ramesses hadn't reckoned on was that the God of the universe happened to have made a promise to Abraham and his descendants to bless them and bless the world through them. And even though Ramesses had done many mighty works and had gifted himself with demigod status, he still wasn't quite in the same league as the real God. And of course, the rest of the story is one of the most well-known parts of the Bible, as God sends 10 unstoppable plagues upon him to prove to him that there really is only one God, and Israel are his people. The way that this is told in the Bible in the book of Exodus is brilliant. The first couple of plagues Pharaoh can actually keep up with. His magicians can copy them. But by the third plague, the magicians concede defeat and tell Pharaoh that this is actually God doing it. By the fourth plague onwards, God pulls into a different league by making sure that the plagues will only affect the Egyptians and not the land where the Israelites are. And with the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally concedes defeat and lets the Hebrews go. And by the hand of Moses, they are led out of Egypt and freed from their slavery. Ramesses was mighty, but he wasn't mighty enough. And this is the defining moment, really, for the Hebrews, the nation of Israel, because this was the moment when they learnt that God was faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so time and again in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Psalms, Israel looked back to the Exodus and remembered God's mighty deeds and how he proved himself, how he rescued them from their slavery. If you asked an ancient Israelite who God is and what he has done in our world, they would have said he showed who he was when he triumphed over Pharaoh and rescued Israel out of slavery. But of course, that was only half of the picture. The whole point all along was that God had chosen Abraham and his people to be his means of transforming the whole world. That was the big picture objective. So not only were they rescued from their slavery, they were also rescued for a new life with God. And the rest of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Jewish Torah, are all about the new life that they began with the God of the universe. He led them across the desert to the good land of Canaan. He came to live in their midst with them in the tabernacle, a kind of portable temple. And he gave them his law. Their law in particular is what would set them apart from the nations around them. It is what would make them the light to the nations, to coin a phrase the prophet Isaiah later used. And so Israel came to the land of Canaan, and after some ups and downs, their lives began to flourish under God's law. The particular high point came under the rule of King Solomon. By this point, Israel had become an impressive nation. They were secure, the money was rolling into the coffers, and they were ruled by a king who had asked God himself for wisdom to govern his people. And finally, the nations around were beginning to pay attention. Solomon was visited by the Queen of Sheba from a faraway land to come and see his kingdom. And when she came, she was bowled over by it, and she glorified the God of Israel, not only because of the wealth of the nation, but also because it was governed with justice and righteousness. You can read all about that in 1 Kings chapter 10. Anyone who has tried to govern a country, and no doubt you've all had a go at some point, will know that acquiring wealth is hard enough, but justice and righteousness, well, dream on. And yet, the history of Israel is one of great hope and crushing disappointment, because it wasn't long before the cracks began to appear. As life went on, Solomon was not careful to follow God's law. His son was a legendary idiot and caused a civil divide, leading to the country being split into two halves with two kings. The north became extremely careless and began to worship the gods of the nations around them, as well as God. Over time, the south followed suit, and compromise and compromise and compromise over hundreds of years. And God had promised to Moses right back at the beginning that if Israel turned their hearts away from him, he would not tolerate it forever. but he would bring it upon their own heads by giving them over into the hands of their enemies. And if they didn't turn and repent, he would let them be taken away back into slavery. And the last state would be worse than the first. Now we're going to dive midway into Israel's history at the point when compromise has begun to set in and move to our next exhibit. So we're going to back out of the Egyptian wing. We're going to head through Egypt in this direction. Apologies if this makes you feel slightly seasick as we go through. Obviously in real life you can't just walk through a column like that, but you can on this interface. And here we are in the Assyrian wing. Let's just see if we can stand right here. Whoops, too far, sorry. Okay, sorry, let me just see if I can get a tiny bit closer than that. The interface is a little bit imprecise. Okay, there we go, brilliant. Now, around about 850 BC, the nation of Assyria, slightly further to the north, was beginning to get more powerful and would become pretty much the world's first superpower. As coincidence would have it, or perhaps divine providence, the more Israel began to slip into compromise and idolatry, the more their enemies like Assyria became a threat. Throughout the Old Testament narrative, God sent them plenty of warnings via the prophets like Elijah and Elisha that if they didn't repent, God would bring calamity upon them. And yet, it was often so much more appealing to try and find a quick fix than do the hard work of actual, genuine, nationwide repentance. Telling a whole nation that they were going to have to stop worshipping Baal and Ashtaroth, the foreign gods, because they'd promised to commit themselves to God alone centuries before, was not likely to be a vote-winning move for Israel's kings. We all know from modern times that getting a whole nation to suddenly change their lives is not easy. And furthermore, quick fixes were available. For example, one easy way to solve the problem was to pay off any enemies who were flexing their muscles. And in fact, if the price was right, you might buy yourself protection from other enemies, which brings us to this black obelisk. This limestone obelisk is one of the many artifacts we've recovered from the Assyrian palace in Nimrud in modern-day Iraq. And it concerns King Shalmaneser III of Assyria, who reigned from 859 to 824 BC. Now you'll notice that the carvings on this obelisk show several scenes with one man bowing down to another. I'm just going to zoom in and see if we can see that. There you go. So you can see it in this panel. One man bowing down to another, one man bowing down to another, and there's some other dudes who are just sort of hanging around and watching. This is because this obelisk was a record of tribute brought by other kings to lay before Shalmaneser. And if you look carefully at the second row here, this man who's bowing down, the inscription above him identifies him as Jehu, king of Israel. This is actually the only known depiction of an Israelite king that has ever been discovered, as far as I'm aware. So as you can imagine, the black obelisk is a pretty valuable artifact, really. If you're planning on robbing the museum during lockdown, then you might like to consider this artifact. We can read about Jehu in the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament, and he was a rather mixed character. At first, he played his part in fighting for reform within Israel. In 2 Kings 9 to 10, he was anointed by the prophet Elisha to enact a great judgment upon the house of Ahab, king of Israel, because Ahab had let the worship of Baal get totally out of control. But then he himself was not careful to follow God's law later in life, and his reforms were short-lived. And furthermore, Israel's dealings with Assyria were only just beginning at that point. And we're just going to navigate around the back. Now on this stele in front of us here, the one on the left, in the middle of the screen, we can see a depiction of Shalmaneser III. And he's the same one as on the obelisk we just looked at. And although he isn't mentioned in the Bible, his records do acknowledge Israelite kings, as we've just seen. And the writing on this stele here talks about the various military pursuits that he's been involved with. And as part of that, he mentions Ahab the Israelite and Ben-Hadad of Syria, which fits with the biblical records. So although the Bible history books were written several centuries later, it shows that Israel kept good records and that the Old Testament is a respectable source of history. Now, I mentioned that Israel's dealings with Assyria were only just getting going, and enter onto the scene Tiglath-Pileser III, or Pul as he's sometimes called in the Bible. And with a name like that, you can understand why he went by a nickname. And he's on this panel over here, if I can stand in front of it. Here we go. So he's the one sitting in the chariot there with the rather girthy parasol sticking above his head there. After a few generations after Shalmaneser III, he became king of Assyria. And at this point, alliances between Israel and Assyria were very uneasy and didn't last long. Doing a deal with Assyria was a bit like doing a deal with the devil. It might have seemed like a good idea to Jehu, but Assyria was about to get a lot more powerful and a lot more treacherous also. Suddenly, Israel began to quake in their boots and realized that they lived in a very uncertain world. God had saved them from Egypt in the past. The point of the unstoppable plagues, if you remember, was to prove that he was the one true God. But what was going to happen now that they had begun to abandon him and turn for help elsewhere? Would he save them? Should they trust in Assyria or oppose them? Could anything stop the might of the king of Assyria? And in the year 732 BC, a monumental event took place for Israel. Pekah, king of Israel, rebelled against Assyria after his predecessor had paid them tribute, and the response was decisive and devastating. No one had ever seen anything like the army that Tiglath-Pileser assembled. It was like a bulldozer that was able to flatten cities and just keep going. In fact, scholars think that this was probably the first professional army, and it made him an unstoppable opponent. He just swept into Israel from the north, took several cities, including in Galilee, where Jesus would begin his ministry several centuries later, and deported them all to Assyria. This, we assume, is what we see happening in this panel. The men on the top row carrying sacks on their shoulders are Israelites here, and we know that because of their distinctive costume. So finally, God's promises were beginning to take effect, that if Israel abandoned the law, he would abandon them to their enemies. And so we see it happening on this panel. Now, this is all the backdrop to the stage that the prophet Isaiah now steps onto. Hopefully, you're beginning to get a feel for the geopolitical situation as Isaiah begins his ministry to the house of Judah in the south of Israel. By this point, if you remember, Israel has become two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, confusingly normally simply called Israel, although sometimes called Ephraim or Samaria, and the southern kingdom called Judah in the region of Judea. And Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the south and was prophet to the kings of Judah. And he was born into a world where an unprecedented war was looming, and he had the unenviable task of saying the hard things that needed to be said to Judah. The deportation of the northern tribes that we see in this panel was very fresh in the mind. In fact, Isaiah refers to it in that famous passage that we read at carol services at Christmas time in chapter 9. He refers to God bringing into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, which is what's going on here. But before we consider what Isaiah had to say in light of the crisis time that was looming in which he lived, we're going to spend a little bit more time first considering just what a formidable opponent the ancient Assyrians really were. Now, one of the nice things about the British Museum is that they've tried to exhibit some of the Assyrian material to somewhat recreate the experience of entering an Assyrian palace. And in front of us, we can see a large wooden gate, which is a replica of the Assyrian palace of Shalmaneser III back in the 9th century, and two guardians standing in front of it that would have stood in front of the door. And before we go and look at the gate more closely, I just want to draw your attention to the guardians. I mean, the first thing to note about them is that they're clearly the original hipsters. I mean, epic beard doesn't even do justice to these guys. And they've got skull caps as well. You kind of get the feeling if these guys rocked up at Shoreditch and ordered a flat white, then nothing would seem amiss at all, except for the fact that they're, you know, massive human-animal hybrids. Or maybe that wouldn't be out of place in Shoreditch. I haven't been in a while. Move on, I hear you all thinking. The thing that I wanted to draw your attention to with these statues is that they are brilliant pieces of sculpture. If you look at them front on, you can see that they give the appearance of strength and solidity. The two front legs stand firm and strong. But as you walk past them, let's see if we can do this, the legs all move and they give the appearance of speed and movement. So strength as you look front on and movement as you go past, which means that they actually have 5 legs. 2 at the front and then 1 which also doubles as one of the 4 as it's moving, which is a very clever piece of sculpture to combine both of those things into one piece. And this is kind of typical of the ancient Assyrians. They were capable of great acts of terror and beauty in equal measure, it seems, which we'll see more of in just a minute. Now, as for the gates, these are replica gates of the palace of Shalmaneser III. And these were typical of the official buildings of the time. And the point of these gates wasn't just for security, but also to communicate something of the power and severity of the king. So let's have a look at them a little bit more closely. And you can see that these metal bands on them are kind of adorned with scenes that try and tell you something about the king and his empire. And in fact, if we spin around and have a look at some of the actual metal replicas, if I can get this just right, then hopefully you'll be able to see. Yeah, you can just about see at the bottom there, there's a dude with his hands and feet being chopped off and impaled on a spike. So, you know, you're getting a sense of what kind of people the Assyrians were. And this is all really just Saturday afternoon for Shalmaneser III. Now, one of the irritating things about going around the British Museum is that invariably, any day that you go, they've gone and roped off one of the things you want to see or you're not able to get in. And even on this digital version, they've made it impossible to get from here into this room, which is where I want to be. But we're going to cheat rather than going the long way around. We're just going to teleport ourselves there. Ding, there we go, brilliant. Right, we're in the room. We got past their way of trying to inconvenience us. Now, continuing the theme of beauty and cruelty rolled into one, in this room we find several panels that adorn the walls of the palace of Ashurbanipal, the last of the great kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And as you follow them round the room, you'll see that they depict a royal lion hunt. They are magnificent works of art with brilliant craftsmanship, but they also depict such a tragically barbaric scene. The detail on them is amazing in these reliefs, but the craftsmen seem particularly keen to show the terror and the agony of the lion as it's being shot with arrows and stabbed and so on. Let me just see if I can zoom in on one of the panels and just show you that. It's not loading properly. There we go. Hopefully you can just kind of see that. The detail on that as the lions are being shot with arrows. Now, you might think that this is an odd thing to depict on the walls of your palace, but the reason for a lion hunt is because it shows to all the officials the absolute power of the king. The lion itself was a symbol of monarchy and power and was used frequently in the ancient world. And so to have the king defeating a lion shows that he can dominate even over the forces of nature. Take the king of the beasts and overpower him. And it communicates a clear message that nothing can stop this king. He can topple empires just as easily as he can topple the mighty lion. Hence the craftsman's desire to show the long and drawn-out scenes of the beast putting up a strong fight, but unable to match the king. Let's just see if we can find him. He's actually killing a lion hand-to-hand on one of the panels just around the corner here. He appears lots of times on these, but here's one example. Yeah, so there you go. There's the king in hand-to-hand combat, slaying the mighty lion himself. So hopefully this gives you a picture of what the ancient Assyrians were like. They were cultured, technologically advanced, capable of great works of art. but also cruel, ruthless, bent on the conquest of other nations. Now, to return to the prophet Isaiah, as I said, Isaiah began his ministry as this crisis was brewing, and it was his job to speak the truth to the rulers of Jerusalem. They had seen the calamity in the north caused by Tiglath-Pileser. Now was the time to take God seriously, and the events of the unfolding Assyrian crisis are the backdrop for the first half of Isaiah's book, that is chapters 1 to 39. These chapters cover the reigns of several kings of Judah, but in particular Ahaz and Hezekiah. And the rough trajectory of these events in these chapters is that the Assyrian army gets closer and closer in several waves until finally they stand outside the gates of Jerusalem, a vast and mighty army in chapter 36. And throughout this section, Isaiah's job as prophet was to warn Jerusalem of the impending destruction that would inevitably come if they didn't take immediate and radical action. Now was the time to take God seriously. And the message was simple. The king of Assyria is fearsome, but he is simply a tool in the Lord's hand. God is the one who is really in charge here, and if you don't turn back to him like you should have done long, long ago, he will allow this calamity to happen. And Isaiah went to great lengths to preach this message. In chapter 20, he mentions walking around naked and barefoot for 3 years, which is quite a thought. I suspect Isaiah may have experienced a little social distancing in his time, which is fair enough. I mean, he wasn't even wearing a face mask. Let's not dwell on that thought. But the reason he did this was as a sign to Jerusalem that Egypt was about to be stripped naked by Assyria. And this was relevant because, as usual, Jerusalem was trying to take the quick fix approach of turning to neighbors such as Egypt for help, rather than turning their hearts back to God. Bad move, guys. Egypt is about to be stripped bare. And the most depressing thing about Isaiah's ministry is that he knew that they wouldn't listen until the Assyrian army was at the gates of Jerusalem. In fact, God tells them this in advance, which you can read about in chapter 6. One clear example of the arrogant defiance and refusal to listen to Isaiah's message came from the king's official, a man named Shebna. In Isaiah chapter 22, Isaiah specifically rebukes him for spending time cutting his own tomb in the hillside. This was normal practice in the ancient world. If you had enough money, you could afford to build a nice family tomb to last for generations. And this is the reason that Isaiah rebuked him. If he was cutting a tomb for himself and for his family, he clearly didn't think there was an impending disaster from the Assyrians on the way. He clearly thought he was going to be sticking around for a while. Now, it just so happens that we have what could very well be the inscription above Shebna's tomb. And normally you can't do this very easily in the museum because you have to walk way over the other side and upstairs. But we're just going to cheekily teleport upstairs. Let's see if we can go to the right room. Yeah, here we go. Suddenly we're in room 57. Brilliant. So here above this panel, we can see that there's a limestone hewn lintel that came from a tomb in Jerusalem that dates from the time of King Hezekiah. And it mentions on the tomb that it belonged to a man named Shebna. And the text is somewhat lost, so archaeologists can't be sure, but there's a good possibility that this is the very same man, and this was the tomb that he built that we've recovered from Jerusalem. However, oracles of warning were only half of the picture of Isaiah's message in the first half of his book. His oracles of impending destruction are interspersed with oracles that are full of confidence about what God will do on the other side. And this is where Isaiah's confidence in God is so astonishing. The world around him looks like it is coming to a certain end and that God is powerless to help, but he is totally confident that this is actually God's work, and it is a necessary measure to clear out all the idolatry and corruption of his people. It is by no means the end. God made a commitment to Israel, and he has an astonishing future planned. For example, when all this is done, God will raise up a new king who will make the king of Assyria appear a distant and fading memory. Let me read for us the rest of that quote in Isaiah chapter 9 that I mentioned earlier. In the former time, God brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. In other words, the deportation by Tiglath-Pileser that we saw on that panel earlier. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And then the next chapter is about the inevitable demise of the king of Assyria after God's work through him is done. And then back to the future king of Israel, who will bring such peace that even the lion will lie down with the lamb. So these two aspects characterize Isaiah's writing, and his oracles pretty much flip-flop between them. On the one hand, warnings about the imminent and unstoppable destruction that is coming at the hand of the king of Assyria, unless Judah takes God seriously. On the other hand, a total confidence that this is all part of the righteous purposes of God, who has a much greater plan to secure peace and bring healing. And one other notable feature about these future pictures is the scale and beauty of them. Remember, God's purposes for Israel were never meant to be just for Israel. Israel was his plan to rescue the whole world. And Isaiah really seemed to get that. So even in passages like the one I just mentioned about Israel's super king who would arise after the Assyrians went down, the effects are global. For example, in chapter 11, verse 10, he says, "In that day the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious." So you can see, God's super king will be king not just of Israel, but of the whole world, and he will bring righteousness to a world that is in a mess. However, as I was saying, Isaiah knew that Judah would not listen until the Assyrian army was at the very gates of Jerusalem. Their army would sweep like a flood into Israel and Judah, as he puts it in chapter 8, which brings us to our next exhibit, and we're going to teleport back to where we were. Back through the lion hunt again. Quite an extensive set of panels if you ever go to the museum. Well worth looking at all of them. And into this room here. Now in this room we have more wall panels from the palace in Nineveh in ancient Assyria. And this time they depict a military campaign rather than a lion hunt. And it's a military campaign showing the defeat of a Judean town called Lachish. This is probably the most significant piece of archaeology, of Assyrian archaeology for this tour, because it actually depicts in carved stone a battle that Isaiah explicitly refers to. Time has moved on from Tiglath-Pileser. His son Shalmaneser V took up the baton from him and pressed further into Israel, and his son Sargon II pushed further still. In the year 722 BC, Sargon completed what Tiglath-Pileser had started and captured and deported the rest of Israel, the northern kingdom. That was their final destruction. But the Assyrian war machine kept rolling on into Judea. Sargon II's son Sennacherib took up the baton next, and with a fresh vigor, he pressed on into Judea in 701 BC. And it's his campaign that we can see depicted in this mural. In chapter 36, Isaiah mentions his campaign because it eventually led to the gates of Jerusalem. He writes, "In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army." Now, Lachish was the second biggest city in Judea after Jerusalem. So this was the last stop in Judea that the Assyrians made before they ended up, inevitably, at Jerusalem itself. And as you walk clockwise around the room, you will see that this mural has a cinematic quality. It once would have been brightly painted as well, but even without that, it still tells the story perfectly clearly. So we're going to zoom in and see if we can look at it a little bit more carefully. So to begin with, at this end, you can see all the archers firing at the walls from distance. And then as we move a little bit closer, you can see that the foot soldiers are getting their shields and spears out, and they're heading towards the walls, the shields above them to protect them from the arrows that are coming down from the walls. Now a little bit further on in the next panel, you can see that they've just begun to start scaling the walls. And they've even got little siege engines here to be able to batter down the walls and towers as they come. Now, the defenders, for their part, are valiantly trying to fight back. Here's a couple of guys in a tower, and they're busy throwing burning torches down onto the siege weapons. That's what these little things are here. But the Assyrians have thought of that. I mean, the detail here is amazing. They've even got a little dude in the battering ram to douse out the fire here with a kind of with a sort of water bucket to stop them from going on fire. So the Assyrians have thought of everything. And here they are scaling the walls, scaling the walls, scaling the walls, and then scaling them all from the other side as well. And the victory happens at some point in this point in the mural, because the next part that you can see is the conquered people busy being taken off into exile. And here they are. Here are the Assyrians, the ones with the pointy hat and the hipster beards. That's them carting off all the treasures. Here are the Israelites with the round hats being forced to be taken with them off into exile. Some of them in a rather undignified manner. And here they are, all being taken round the corner and forced to bow down, inevitably, at the feet of King Sennacherib himself, sitting on the throne in the middle. Of course, the whole mural inevitably leads round to him. And the inscription above his head there talks about this little panel here, talks about the booty of Lachish passing before him and the elders being forced to bow down in front of him. Now back to the prophet Isaiah again. As I said earlier, Isaiah's ministry was to warn Judah that if they didn't take the right action and turn their hearts back to God, the Assyrian army would just keep going. And he knew up front that Judah wouldn't listen until the army was at the doorstep. So when the Rabshakeh stands outside the gates of Jerusalem, having just come from Lachish, this really is the event that Isaiah's whole lifetime's ministry has been building up to. And the events that follow pretty much validate his prophetic work as a whole. Remember, his claim all along had been that it didn't matter how terrifying the Assyrian army were, and they simply look, and they certainly do look terrifying, as we've just seen on this mural. They were simply a tool in the Lord God's hand. God himself is really the one true king, and this is all part of his plan and purpose. The only sensible course of action is to turn back to him in humility. So far, Judah had been scrabbling around trying to get other nations like Egypt to protect them, who had been no help at all. And Isaiah spends much of chapters 28 to 33, the bit just before the army gets to Jerusalem, repeatedly face-palming. It's like they're all blind drunkards groping around in the dark for a solution, when the solution is staring them in the face. Now, I just want you to sit back for a minute and reflect on what Isaiah was really asking King Hezekiah, the king of Judah at the time, to do. Have another look at the mural on this wall and the unstoppable might and power of the king of Assyria. Then imagine him with his army outside the gates of Jerusalem, you know, sort of Lord of the Rings, Battle of Helm's Deep style, after having defeated Lachish. The only sensible course of action is to come out waving the white flag and be taken away off into exile. Indeed, the Rabshakeh himself points this out to the inhabitants of Jerusalem in chapter 36. He says, "Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you by saying, 'The Lord will deliver us.' Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria?" It's a pretty convincing taunt. And all Hezekiah has is a crazy old man with a beard who spent 3 years walking around naked, saying that he needs to turn back to the Lord in humility and God will save him. What would you do if you were Hezekiah? Well, what happens is fascinating. Hezekiah does as Isaiah tells him to and doesn't give in to the taunts of the Rabshakeh. And the next thing that was supposed to happen was, of course, the siege of Jerusalem. But it never happened. In Isaiah's retelling, and in the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, where this also appears in the Old Testament, his whole word was vindicated because God sent out an angel of destruction and brought down the whole Assyrian army overnight, such that they had to return home. It's one of the most astonishing events in the whole of the Old Testament. Just as God had promised, once Assyria had done their work that he had allowed, and when Jerusalem had turned back to him in humility, he would hold Sennacherib to account for his own arrogance, presuming that he was mightier than God himself. And he destroyed 185,000 of his army. And when Sennacherib returned home to regroup, he would later be assassinated by his own sons. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus also records that a great multitude of the Assyrian army fell, although he offers a different explanation. Naturally, the Assyrian records don't mention a military loss at all, but they do agree that Sennacherib never took the city. For a start, look at this mural. They had to make the siege of Lachish, not Jerusalem, the commemorative event of the campaign. And you can bet that if they'd taken Jerusalem, that's what we'd be seeing. But furthermore, we also have a written record from Assyria on a clay prism, which is kept in a glass case on the other side of the room here. Whoops, too far. At least it's supposed to be kept here, but irritatingly, even on the virtual tour, there's one exhibit that you can't see because they loaned it out to another museum when this was being photographed. But if you have a look in the handout, you can see a picture of it instead. It's a clay prism called the Taylor prism, about 30 centimeters tall, with writing all over it. And it's an Assyrian record of all the achievements of Sennacherib and the gods that he worshipped. So it only tells us the positives of his campaign, that's the point. And part of what it records is about what happened when Sennacherib got to Jerusalem. He boasts that having taken all the cities of Judea, because they did not submit to his yoke, he then came to Jerusalem and trapped Hezekiah like a caged bird, which, if you read between the lines, clearly shows that he failed to take Jerusalem. Instead, he makes a big deal about a tribute that Hezekiah paid to him. And that's a smart claim, because if you don't want future readers to ask too many questions, given Hezekiah had indeed paid a big tribute to him already, then that's a sensible thing to record. But it's a bit of a disappointing end to his whole campaign. Or from the Judean perspective, an incredible rescue, just as Isaiah had promised. Now, there's a final interesting postscript to all of this. We need to go back to Sennacherib himself. Which is, if you look at him carefully there, whoops, there we go. If you look carefully, you can see that his face has been chipped away just here. This was probably done, and this adds a certain irony to the effect of the whole mural, I think. This was probably done by later Babylonian forces when their empire caused the demise of the Assyrian one, and they did to Nineveh what Nineveh had done to Lachish. And it's quite clever, really, because in one simple piece of ballad work, it undermines the boast of the whole mural. And it all fits with Isaiah's view of the situation, which is that the Lord God is the only one who is high and exalted, and all arrogant human leaders will come crashing down eventually and end up in the British Museum. As he writes in chapter 14, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook the kingdoms?" And I love those words because now every day people from all over the world come to the British Museum and pass Sennacherib, the great morning star, and say, has he got his face missing? Now we've got one final piece of part of the Assyria section to see, and that's another set of wall reliefs in an adjacent room. So I'm just going to head through. Past a couple more human-headed bull guardians. Now, just while we're on the way, I just want to draw your attention to this rather scruffy-looking panel here, which was taken from underneath one of the human-headed bulls. And this talks about the tribute that Hezekiah paid to King Sennacherib in a little bit more detail. And the interesting thing about this is that at first it appeared that the weight of gold and silver was different from what the Bible said that it was. But when they did a correction, when they realized that actually the Assyrians used a different measure of weight, when they did the correction, they realized that actually it was a very close match with what the Bible said. So again, it's just another detail that you just dig up out of the ground and discover that the Old Testament historians kept good records, even to the level of the tribute that was paid by Hezekiah to King Sennacherib. Okay. After Sennacherib's failure to take Jerusalem in 701 BC, the Assyrians didn't make another attempt to come back. And 80 years later, the whole empire would crumble and give way to the Babylonians, as I just mentioned, thus fulfilling Isaiah's words and some of the other Old Testament prophets, who spoke against Assyria's final end. The Babylonian king Nabopolassar rebelled against Assyria, marched against Nineveh, and burned it to the ground in 612 BC. These are some more panels from the palace in Nineveh, and you can see clear evidence of the demise of the city. A palace of that scale, built of stone, doesn't fall easily, and so the palace wasn't totally destroyed, but you can see the clear evidence of a great fire. Look at the black scorch marks over these panels on this side, and then perhaps even more clearly on this side. Nineveh was burnt and left deserted, thus fulfilling in particular the words of the prophet Nahum, who spoke specifically about fire devouring Nineveh. And over time it became covered up until it was excavated in 1847, and these panels were recovered and brought to the British Museum. So that was the end of the Assyrian Empire that dominated the world stage when Isaiah was prophesying. But of course, as I was saying earlier, Isaiah's oracles were not just about Assyria and the events of his own lifetime. The central part of his message was that God is the real one in charge, and he has much bigger plans and purposes. Plans that reach far beyond Judah's terrible but necessary destruction during the Assyrian campaign. Isaiah's oracles flip-flop between that and a much greater and more wonderful future that God purposes on the other side. And the rescue of Jerusalem and the demise of Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, are really the key things that validate Isaiah's words. Not because the rescue of Jerusalem was the glorious future itself. In fact, it was quite short-lived because God hadn't finished his work of judgment. The Babylonians came and finished the job off later. But rather because it proved in a real historical event that God really was the one in charge, and he was perfectly capable of a great rescue when the time was right. In other words, given the example of the rescue of Jerusalem from Sennacherib, it makes it a whole lot easier to believe the rest of Isaiah's oracles about the future. Because Isaiah has a very big picture view of God and God's purposes for our world. According to Isaiah, God won't stop until he's rescued the whole of creation and made it new. And so the second half of Isaiah's book, from chapter 40 to the end, all looks beyond both Assyrian and Babylonian crises in the immediate historical context. The climax of the whole book is in chapter 65, the penultimate chapter, where God says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered." Isaiah's visions were always looking forward, looking bigger. The immediate events of the Assyrian crisis in his lifetime are all part of God's story for Israel that will eventually lead to him making the whole of creation new. And the final chapter ends where he started, with a picture of God as the one who is far mightier than any human king. "Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. All these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be, declares the Lord." Chapter 66, verse 1. Now that would be a fitting end for the tour, but we have just one more artifact that it would be a great injustice to leave out, because this artifact begins to push us beyond Assyria and into that future that Isaiah looked towards. And for this, we're going to need to teleport again all the way to the other side of the museum and upstairs to the Persian wing. Here we go. This, in real life, you would have been traipsing all the way through the museum and up some stairs and so on. So I've saved you a lot of effort. Now, what we have in this glass box here, let me just zoom in a little bit, is an extremely boring looking but very significant clay cylinder. And it comes from the time of the Persian king Cyrus. Now, to fill you in on the history, after the Assyrian Empire fell to the Babylonians, it in turn fell to the Persian Empire. Babylon had been the ones to take Jerusalem, and the rest of Judea that was left after the Assyrian campaigns. And so they deported most of the Jews to Babylon. So when Babylon was taken over by the Persians in a peaceful victory in 539 BC, the Jews all came under the authority of the Persian king Cyrus. The second half of Isaiah's book begins with a whole section in chapters 40 to 55 that are all about forgiveness and a fresh start. They picture a wonderful future beyond the exile, where God will demonstrate his faithfulness to Israel. Yes, he brought Assyria and Babylon against them because of their idolatry and injustices, but that's by no means the end of the story. He will put them back on track, and his plan for the world in and through them back on track, all the way through to the new heavens and the new earth in the final section of the book. Here are the opening verses of chapter 40 that picture the return of the Lord to his people. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And chapters 40 to 55 go on to talk about what God will begin to do to provide forgiveness and a fresh start. And one of the signs of God's forgiveness in this section will be that he will take his people back to Jerusalem once more at the hand of the Persian king Cyrus. And they will be able to rebuild the city into a new Jerusalem, which will eventually become a place of everlasting joy and no weeping, as pictured in chapter 65 in the New Heavens and the New Earth passage. Now, this is an astonishing part of the book because if it was written by Isaiah himself, he specifically names the Persian king who will do this over a century later, which has led many scholars to wonder whether this is a compilation work that Isaiah started and his disciples finished. It's a complicated scholarly question, but whichever is true, it doesn't change the content. The Jews will return at the hand of Cyrus, and they will know that this is part of the package, that God hasn't forgotten and is committed to a fresh start. Now, in the past, skeptical scholars thought that Isaiah had just made this bit up, whoever had written it. I mean, after all, whoever had heard of a king who would willingly send his captured subjects back home again? The whole point of capturing enemy nations was to enslave them to do your chores for you. They were your dishwashers and washing machines and so on. But then in 1879, this clay cylinder was excavated in the ruins of ancient Babylon. And it's effectively an official document talking about the foreign policy of King Cyrus the Great of Persia. And although the text doesn't mention the Jews specifically, what it does tell us is that Cyrus's policy was indeed to send captive nations home again to rebuild their lands and their temples, which fits exactly with what Isaiah and some of the other Old Testament books say. The text reads, I return them unharmed to their cells in the sanctuaries that make them happy. May all the gods that I return to their sanctuaries ask for a long life for me and mention my good deeds. It turned out that Cyrus actually had a very advanced foreign policy and realized that the way to manage an empire was to give people their homelands back again. They would be much more likely to cooperate with you. And so the Jews were indeed sent home to begin to rebuild their land. But part of what is fascinating about all of this is that when the Jews did indeed return home to Jerusalem at the hand of Cyrus, as Isaiah said would happen, it became clear very quickly that the spectacular pictures that Isaiah had given of the New Jerusalem were a long way from being realized. It was not a land in which righteousness dwelt yet. It was not a land of no tears. It was not a land that the nations would flock to. In many ways, nothing much had really changed at all. It was clear that what Isaiah predicted was something much greater than simply a return back to the city. A much bigger and deeper work of God was needed than just that. And sure enough, as you read on through chapters 40 to 55, you begin to see that there is much more talked about than a return, simply a return to Jerusalem, thanks to Cyrus. Those chapters make way for some much deeper and more intriguing passages about one who will rise up from within the new Israel that God will make. And true reconciliation with God and a fresh start will happen when he voluntarily takes the reproach of the many upon himself and bears their sins for them. And so in chapter 53, we have the famous picture of the servant who suffers on behalf of the many. In chapter 54, God makes a new binding commitment to his people that will never go wrong. And in chapter 55, he begins the work of healing the very fabric of creation itself. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. And if this feels like it rings any bells, then it should do, because half a century later, the first Christians would come to the conclusion that Isaiah's words had begun to find their true fulfillment in the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. They claimed that Jesus, God's true king, died willingly on a cross to bear the sins of many upon himself and rose from the dead, the first sign of God's whole new creation. Yes, the return to Jerusalem, thanks to Cyrus, had been a start, but here was a rescue on a new level altogether, one over even the power and forces of death itself. As they stood before the risen Lord Jesus, they realized that Isaiah's words were really coming to pass. And the next step was obvious: go and tell the nations, just as Isaiah anticipated. In fact, in his famous letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul would end the main part of his letter by quoting from Isaiah chapter 11 that Isaiah spoke all the way back when the king of Assyria looked so powerful. The root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the nations, and in him the nations will hope. Ramesses II, Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, Cyrus the Great, one way or another, every great king of the past has ended up in the British Museum. But according to Paul, Jesus is risen from the dead and begun to rule the whole world as the king that Isaiah predicted. But he has a different, and in my view, even more powerful kingdom than the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or the Persians, one where anyone is welcome to join and find in him forgiveness with God and the beginnings of the new heavens and the new earth that Isaiah saw so clearly.